Is this still photo or video?
Video. But I'm gonna edit most of it out.
Good.
Is that a video camera?
Yeah, it doubles as a video camera.
My gosh. Okay.
What do you guys remember from growing up? Something that like the history textbooks won't talk about.
Well, I was born in 1929, about 2 weeks before the Depression, before the crash rather. And so the real Depression was when I was going through grade school and growing up. And I can remember that everybody was poor. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in the city. And everyone was poor. And I think, like movies were 11 cents. And the inducement to go to movies was they'd pick out the slowest night, a Tuesday night. And if you went on Tuesday night, they give you a coffee cup. And then when you went the following Tuesday night, they give you the saucer for that cup. And then the next Tuesday, they'd give you a dinner plate. And the following week, they'd give you a soup bowl. And some people built their whole dinnerware set by going to the movies, which, by the way, was 11 cents. And I can remember people, almost every other person was without a job. And I remember there was a time when people had, before they had refrigerated, they had what was called an ice box. Yeah. And people delivered ice to the house.
So big blocks of ice under
Big block of ice, yeah. And that same man later, and it was a horse-drawn wagon that he had. And his name was Mr. Minerva. I still remember it. And his son became my closest friend because we went all through grade school together and played sports together. And speaking of sports, there was a lot of street games that you played.
Yeah.
And our neighborhood was so poor that no one on the block or on the street had a football.
Yeah.
Couldn't afford to buy a football. So we rolled up the Daily News and tightened it with twine so it was about the length of a football and it was about the weight of it.
Okay.
And you threw that ball around and that was a football. And if you had a baseball, the neighborhood had one baseball. And you played on a lot that had rocks and pebbles. And if the cover became torn, you bought some electrical tape, black tape, and you just taped that football, and you might use it for 3 or 4 weeks until somehow someone managed to get a baseball somehow through a birthday present or something like that.
Wow.
And I remember people had food stamps. My family didn't have a car because in the city, that was really expensive, and so a lot of people, we had good streetcar transportation, trolley cars and subways, and that's about all that I can remember growing up. And then when I became a teenager and entered high school and started playing sports, World War II came along, and all of a sudden there was opportunities and jobs available. And the men, most of them were between 18 and 35. They were drafted into some branch of the service, and in so doing, that left a shortage of people going to work. So women started going to work, and you see women wearing pantsuits and slacks, I guess they call them for the women. And that was a whole new era. And you'd see planes flying overhead, military planes. I remember the first time we saw a P-38 fighter. We thought that was the strangest, maybe like a flying object to us. And also, all of the people that had cars, they had to blacken out the top half of the headlights. So
the bombers couldn't see them.
The bombers couldn't pick it up.
Wow.
And there was a bank building, the tallest building in Brooklyn, and that still might be the case. It was about 35 or 40 stories high, and on top, on each side, there was a clock on all 4 sides. And the whole area would glance up anytime, day or night, and that's how they set their clocks. I remember getting ready for school. I wondered if it was getting late, and I just look out the window instead of going into another room where there was a clock. And the clock at night was lighted. And then during the war, they sighted German submarines off of Long Island. So they dimmed those lights on the hands of the clock. And that kind of brought the war a little closer. You thought, my God, the Germans are here. Yeah. And the big sigh of relief came that when the war in Europe was virtually won, they put those lights on again, and it was like, oh, gee, we're safer now, you know? Yeah. But I'm talking too much. My wife wants a little...
What do you remember about?
Well, I remember my parents talking about the fear of the banks closing. And my dad said to my mother, the first thing tomorrow morning, I want you to go to the bank before the Depression and take all our money out. And you just be standing there when the bank opens, you get the money out. But they'd been printing the news that, oh, banks are safe and everything's okay. So she went with her mother, and they're standing there and the door open. And no one had ever paid any attention to them in the bank before. And all of a sudden the president said, oh, well, come in my office and have some coffee and so forth. And, oh, your money's very safe. So my grandmother said, oh, this is wonderful. I'll leave, our money. And my mother said, oh, I've got to face my husband. I better take the money. So she took the money, and as they walked out the door, he locked the door and pulled the shade, and that was the end of anybody getting money out of the bank.
Yeah.
And then things became hard for them, and my dad had a speedboat. So it was summertime in Chicago, so they lived on the beach and gave speedboat rides for those who could afford them. And they camped out and had a tent, and this was before I was born, and made it a summer holiday. Wow. And then they went to live on the farm. His family were farmers in Minnesota. And they lived there for a couple years until he could save enough money to get back and get in the machinery business, which he did.
Yeah. The money they collected, they buried in the sand, didn't they?
They buried in the sand because they lived in a tent. Yeah, they were tenting on the beach, like honeymooners, and made it like a summer vacation.
That's awesome.
But
and later on he had his own yachts.
Really?
Oh yeah. Well, he had a speedboat then.
Yeah, a great American story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it grew.
You said like something earlier about your brother, how he would like pinpoint where he's been in the war?
Yes. During World War II, my brother had a study room, and one whole wall was a map. And he was totally into it because he was around 12 at the time. So he was old enough to really follow it. And he had pins, and every battle had a pin, and he would trace where the battles were going and so forth. And I was too young to really know exactly what was going on, but I was very impressed because I knew that, first of all, I couldn't touch the pins in the map. I knew that. But second of all, I realized what they represented.
The battles, yeah.
All the battles that were going on and where the troops were making progress. And when we would get letters, of course, they were all censored. So there'd be big blackouts. I mean, you'd never get a full sentence in a letter from anyone in the war, because they'd have all these big black lines of censorship.
Yeah, and it was called V-mail. V as in victory.
Wow.
And because to save weight, it was paper thin, sort of like a tissue that they wrote on.
Oh, okay.
And so they could write more for the same amount of weight and postage. But the postage coming from the service members free. They didn't pay anything, and you just wrote the address would be post office box 123, New York, and then the Army took over from them and would forward it up front, depending on, because in the address it would be Corporal or Sergeant McGrath, 29th Combat Engineers. So after the post office circulated it to the Army, then the Army would know where the combat engineers were. And that's how the servicemen received their stuff. Yeah. And then they had, like in high school, I used to go to the Brooklyn Dodger games, and one game you would bring old rubber tires or what have you. The next game you'd bring old pots and pans. They'd have like a metal drive or a rubber drive, and all of that contributed to the war. And then I had my dad, being a widower with two children, he wasn't drafted, but his younger brother, my Uncle Eddie, went to the war. He was in the combat engineers, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge in Germany, and he was only overseas in combat for about 6 months, but in that time he received 2 Silver Stars, which is about maybe the second highest decoration. No, it's the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, and then I think it's the Silver Star. And he received 2 of those, and was wounded twice, and he was wounded twice in about 3 weeks, one by a grenade and one by a rifle or a bullet. And he was involved in the capturing Remagen Bridge, which was the first bridge over the Rhine that the Allied forces took. And he came home with a piece of shrapnel in his head that they opted to leave in there rather than try to remove it. And upon discharge, he went to work for the Veterans Administration and worked with that for years and retired. And when he retired, he headed up the Veterans Administration for all of Brooklyn.
Wow.
Yeah.
My stepfather was served under Patton.
Mm-hmm.
He loved General Patton, and he was in Italy, and he was in a tank,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no bathroom facilities in a tank, so it stopped, and he got out to use the bushes of whatever, and the tank was blown up, and everybody was killed. And it happened right at Christmas time, and every Christmas when they came around, he was always very sad and very stressed over the fact that it was just a fluke that he wasn't killed, but all his buddies were.
And it's been hard to get him out of the bathroom ever since. He deemed it to be the safest place in the house. Okay?
No kidding. I have one more thing. What did you think of like Roosevelt growing up? Roosevelt and Truman, just as president.
Well, Roosevelt was the only person we knew,
Yeah.
because he served 3 terms,
Mm-hmm.
or was it 4? I think it may have been, he was going to run for the 4th term when he died. He died in Hot Springs, Arkansas, I believe. And Truman was his vice president, and he came in, and he had to make the tough decision of whether or not to drop the atom bomb, because all the statistics that they had suggested that if we tried to invade in Japan, it would cost many American lives. So that was a tough decision to make, but that, of course, ended the war and brought everyone home. And on that subject, I was visiting with my Uncle Eddie's wife and little baby girl on Christmas Day in 1945, when the doorbell rang and my Uncle Eddie came home from Europe.
Wow.
And he had not seen his little girl, and there she was, and my dad and I thought it would be a good time for us to leave after we said our hellos.
Yeah.
So that was, I'll never forget that. That was being a witness to a real happy occasion.
Absolutely.
You know.